Sometimes the most powerful moments in royal history don't happen during grand ceremonies or state visits. They happen in quiet corridors, behind palace doors, when a young princess looks up at the adults around her and says words that echo through generations. What happens when an 8-year-old girl, born into one of the world's most watched families, faces a moment that could define not just her day, but her entire understanding of who she is meant to be? What happens when doubt creeps into even the most privileged life, and a child must choose between shrinking away or standing tall? This is the story of Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana, a little girl who carried the weight of 3 names, 3 legacies, and the expectations of an entire nation. But more than that, it's the story of the day she discovered something that no royal title could give her and no protocol could teach her. The day she learned that belonging isn't about where you're placed in life. It's about knowing, deep in your heart, that you have every right to take up space in this world. This is the story of 4 simple words that changed everything. I belong here. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long golden streaks across the polished floors. Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana sat at her small breakfast table, her legs swinging slightly as she picked at her porridge. At 8 years old, she had already learned that mornings in the palace followed a rhythm as precise as clockwork. Her nanny would arrive at 7 sharp, her breakfast would be served at 7:30, and by 8:15 she would be ready for whatever royal duty or private lesson awaited her. But this Tuesday morning felt different. Charlotte could sense it, in the way the household staff whispered a little more quietly as they passed her door, in the way her mother, the Princess of Wales, had kissed her forehead just a moment longer than usual before hurrying off to her own morning engagements. Even the family's cocker spaniel, Orla, seemed to sense something unusual, staying closer to Charlotte's side instead of racing around the gardens as she usually did. Charlotte had inherited many things from her royal lineage. From her great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, she had received a sense of duty that seemed to flow through her veins like royal blood itself. From her grandfather, King Charles III, she had inherited a deep love for nature and a curiosity about the world that extended far beyond palace walls. From her father, Prince William, she had gained a protective instinct for those she loved and a smile that could light up any room. But perhaps most importantly, from her grandmother Diana, whose name she carried as her 3rd name, Charlotte had inherited something that couldn't be taught in any royal protocol class: an ability to connect with people from all walks of life, to see beyond titles and positions, to the human heart beneath. As Charlotte finished her breakfast, her private secretary, Mrs. Henderson, appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Henderson had worked for the royal family for over 20 years, and Charlotte had grown fond of her gentle manner and the way she always seemed to know exactly what Charlotte needed before she even asked for it. "Your Royal Highness," Mrs. Henderson said with a warm smile, "there's been a change in today's schedule. The charity visit to St. Mary's Children's Hospital has been moved up by 2 hours. We'll need to leave in 30 minutes. Charlotte's stomach did a little flip. She had been preparing for this visit for weeks. St. Mary's was a special place, a hospital that cared for children who were facing serious illnesses. Some of these children had been fighting battles that most adults couldn't imagine, and yet Charlotte had heard that they maintained spirits that could inspire anyone who met them. The visit was part of her gradual introduction to royal duties, a chance for her to begin understanding the role she would one day play in supporting causes and people who needed help. But Charlotte had been feeling uncertain about this visit. Unlike the garden parties and ceremonial events where she knew exactly what was expected of her, this felt different. How do you talk to children who might be scared or in pain? What if she said the wrong thing? What if she didn't know how to help them feel better? These questions had been swirling in her mind for days. And now, with the visit happening sooner than expected, those worries felt even bigger. As Charlotte got ready, choosing a simple blue dress that her mother had told her would be both appropriate and comfortable, she thought about a conversation she'd overheard the week before. 2 of the palace staff members had been talking about her upcoming hospital visit, and one of them had said something that had stuck with her. "Well, she's just a child herself, isn't she? What could she possibly offer to those sick children?" It seems a bit much putting that kind of pressure on someone so young. Those words had planted a seed of doubt in Charlotte's mind. Was she too young for this responsibility? Did she really belong in these situations where people were counting on the royal family for comfort and support? The weight of her full name, Charlotte Elizabeth Diana, suddenly felt heavier. Each name carried such significance, such expectations. Elizabeth, after her great-grandmother, who had dedicated her entire life to service. Diana, after the grandmother she'd never met but whose legacy of compassion and connection with people from all backgrounds had shaped the very foundations of how the modern royal family approached their duties. As Charlotte's lady-in-waiting helped her into her coat, Charlotte caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked every inch the young princess she was. Her hair neatly braided, her dress pressed and proper, her small tiara pin catching the light. But inside she felt like just Charlotte, an 8-year-old girl who wasn't sure if she was ready for what lay ahead. The drive to St. Mary's Children's Hospital took 25 minutes through London's winding streets. Charlotte sat quietly in the back seat of the royal car, watching the city pass by through tinted windows. She could see people on the sidewalks going about their daily lives, and she wondered what it would be like to walk among them without anyone recognizing her, without anyone expecting anything special from her. Mrs. Henderson noticed Charlotte's quiet mood and leaned over to speak softly to her. "You know, Your Royal Highness, I remember when your father was about your age and facing his first big public engagement. He was so nervous that he asked your grandmother if he could bring his favorite toy soldier in his pocket for courage." Charlotte looked up, interested despite her nerves. Did she let him? Not only did she let him, Mrs. Henderson smiled, but she brought her own small lucky charm with her that day too. Sometimes we all need a little something to remind us that we're never alone in the important moments. As they pulled up to the hospital, Charlotte could see a small crowd of people waiting outside. There were hospital staff, some media photographers kept at a respectful distance, and a few families who had gathered to catch a glimpse of the young princess. Charlotte's heart started beating faster. In just a few minutes, she would step out of this car and into a role that felt both too big and too important for someone her age. But as she looked out at the hospital building, Charlotte noticed something that made her pause. In several of the windows, she could see small faces pressed against the glass, children who were patients at the hospital looking down with excitement and curiosity. Some of them were waving their faces bright with anticipation. These weren't the faces of children who needed her to be perfect or to have all the answers. These were children who were simply excited to meet another child, someone who might understand them in a way that adults sometimes couldn't. Charlotte took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. Maybe the question wasn't whether she belonged here. Maybe the question was whether she was brave enough to show up as herself and trust that sometimes that was exactly what people needed. As the car door opened and Charlotte prepared to step out into the crisp London air, she made a decision. She would try to push aside the voice in her head that said she wasn't ready, wasn't old enough, wasn't enough. Instead, she would focus on the faces in those windows, on the children who were waiting to meet her, not because she was perfect, but because she was there, ready to share whatever light she had to offer. The first test of that decision would come sooner than she expected. As Charlotte stepped out of the car, a young reporter managed to get close enough to ask her a question that no one had prepared her for. "Princess Charlotte, some people are saying you're too young to be doing these serious royal duties. How do you respond to that?" For a moment, Charlotte felt the familiar flutter of doubt in her stomach. The words she'd overheard at the palace came flooding back. But then she looked up at those hospital windows again, at the faces of children who were fighting battles much bigger than her own, uncertainty, and something shifted inside her. Charlotte looked directly at the reporter, her voice clear and steady despite her young age. "I think being young means I can understand what it's like to sometimes feel scared or uncertain. Maybe that's exactly what those children need to see today." As she walked toward the hospital entrance, Charlotte felt something she hadn't expected. For the first time since learning about this visit, she wasn't thinking about whether she belonged here. She was thinking about what she could give, what she could share, and how she might help brighten someone else's day. The doubt was still there, but it was no longer in the driver's seat. The automatic doors of St. Mary's Children's Hospital whooshed open with a gentle mechanical sound that somehow felt both welcoming and intimidating to Charlotte. The lobby was bright and colorful, with painted murals of cartoon characters and inspirational quotes covering the walls. But underneath the cheerful decorations, Charlotte could sense something else: the quiet intensity of a place where serious things happened, where children and families faced challenges that most people could barely imagine. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the hospital's chief pediatrician, approached Charlotte with a warm smile. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Charlotte had been told that Dr. Mitchell had dedicated her entire career to helping sick children, and that she had specifically requested that Charlotte's visit be as natural and unscripted as possible. "Your Royal Highness, Doctor," Mitchell said, extending her hand for a handshake rather than the formal curtsy that Charlotte was accustomed to. "Thank you so much for coming to see us today. The children have been talking about nothing else for weeks." As they walked through the hospital corridors, Dr. Mitchell explained some of the work that St. Mary's did. They specialized in treating children with rare diseases, children who often had to stay in the hospital for weeks or even months at a time. Many of these children had become like a family to each other, supporting one another through treatments that were frightening and difficult. "The thing about sick children," Dr. Mitchell said as they walked, "is that they have a wisdom that often surpasses their years. They understand things about courage and hope that many adults never learn. I think you'll find that they have as much to teach you as you do to offer them." Charlotte nodded, but inside, her nerves were growing stronger. What if she said something that upset one of the children? What if she couldn't think of anything helpful to say at all? As they approached the pediatric ward, Charlotte could hear sounds of laughter and conversation coming from behind the doors. It sounded like any group of children playing together. Except Charlotte knew that each of these children was fighting a battle that she couldn't fully understand. The first room they entered was the playroom, a large space filled with toys, books, and art supplies. About 15 children were scattered around the room, ranging in age from about 5 to 13. Some were in wheelchairs, some had tubes and medical equipment attached to them, and some looked perfectly healthy except for the hospital bracelets on their wrists. What struck Charlotte immediately was not their medical conditions, but their eyes, bright, curious, and filled with an energy that seemed to light up the entire room. "Everyone, Dr. Joe," Mitchell announced, "I'd like you to meet Princess Charlotte. She's come to spend some time with us today." For a moment, there was silence. Charlotte felt every eye in the room focused on her, and the familiar feeling of uncertainty crept up her spine. These children had been through so much. What could she possibly say that would matter to them? Then a voice piped up from the corner of the room. "Are you really a princess, or do you just dress like one?" The question came from a boy who looked to be about Charlotte's age, sitting in a wheelchair with a mischievous grin on his face. He had lost his hair, presumably from treatment, but his smile was infectious and completely unintimidated by Charlotte's royal status. Charlotte found herself smiling back. "Well, I am really a princess, but most of the time I just feel like a regular girl who happens to live in a palace." "That's brilliant," said a girl of about 10 who was working on a puzzle at a nearby table. "I'm Emma, and I'm really sick, but most of the time I just feel like a regular girl who happens to live in a hospital." The room erupted in giggles, and Charlotte felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to relax. These children weren't looking at her with the formal reverence she was used to from adults. They were looking at her with curiosity, humor, and a directness that was both refreshing and slightly nerve-wracking. Over the next hour, Charlotte moved around the playroom, talking with different children about their hobbies, their families, and their experiences in the hospital. She learned that Marcus, the boy in the wheelchair who had first spoken to her, was an expert on dinosaurs and could name more species than most paleontologists. She discovered that Emma, despite being in the middle of a difficult treatment, was writing a book about a brave princess who went on adventures to help people in need. "The thing about being sick," Emma explained to Charlotte as they worked on the puzzle together, is that it teaches you what's really important. Like, I used to worry about silly things like whether people liked my clothes or if I was good enough at soccer. But now I know that the most important thing is just being kind to people and trying to make them smile. Charlotte was struck by the profound simplicity of Emma's words. Here was a 10-year-old girl who had gained wisdom through suffering that many adults never achieve, and she was sharing it as casually as she might discuss her favorite color. As the visit continued, Charlotte found herself in conversation with a 13-year-old named David who had been in the hospital for 3 months. David was quiet and thoughtful, spending most of his time reading thick books about history and science. When Charlotte asked him what he wanted to do when he got better, his answer surprised her. "I want to become a doctor here," David said without hesitation. "Not because I want to fix everyone. I know that's not always possible. But because I want kids who end up in this hospital to have someone who understands what it feels like to be scared and unsure. Someone who can tell them that being brave doesn't mean you're never afraid." Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest as she listened to David. Here was a boy only 5 years older than her who had faced challenges she couldn't imagine. And he was talking about courage in a way that made her reconsider everything she thought she knew about bravery. "David," Charlotte said quietly, "can I ask you something? Do you ever feel like you don't belong somewhere? Like you're not ready for something that people expect you to do?" "All the time," he said. "When I first got sick, I felt like I didn't belong in the hospital. All these other kids seemed so much braver than me, so much better at handling everything. But then I realized something. Belonging isn't about being ready or being perfect. It's about showing up and being willing to learn, even when you're scared." Charlotte nodded, feeling David's words settling into her heart like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was trying to solve. As the afternoon progressed, Charlotte participated in art activities, listened to stories the children had written, and even helped serve snacks during their break time. With each interaction, she felt less like she was performing a royal duty and more like she was simply spending time with new friends who happened to be going through extraordinary circumstances. But it was during a quiet moment, when Charlotte was sitting with a 5-year-old named Lily who was recovering from surgery, that Charlotte faced her biggest test yet. Lily had been very quiet throughout the visit, watching Charlotte from a distance but not participating in the group activities. When Charlotte approached Lily's bed, the little girl looked up with serious eyes and asked, "Are you scared sometimes?" The question caught Charlotte off guard. All afternoon, the children had been asking her about palace life, about her brothers, about what it was like to be a princess. But Lily's question cut straight to the heart of something Charlotte had been struggling with, not just today, but for weeks. Charlotte could have given a polite royal answer about how she felt confident and prepared for her duties. She could have deflected the question or changed the subject. But looking into Lily's honest, trusting eyes, Charlotte found herself wanting to give the most truthful answer she could. "Yes," Charlotte said softly. "I get scared sometimes. Today, I was scared that I wouldn't know what to say to make you all feel better, or that I was too young to be here with you." Lily nodded solemnly. "I get scared about my surgery," she whispered, "and about whether the medicine will work." For a moment, Charlotte and Lily just sat together in comfortable silence. Then Lily reached out and took Charlotte's hand in her small one. "But you know what?" Lily said. "I think being scared is okay because it means we care about what happens. And caring is the most important thing." As Charlotte held Lily's hand, she realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of what this visit was supposed to be about. She had come here thinking that she needed to have answers, needed to be strong and confident and inspirational. But what these children had taught her was something entirely different. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up authentically, admit your fears, and trust that connection can happen in the space between two people who are both trying to figure things out. When it was time for Charlotte to leave, the children gathered in the playroom to say goodbye. Marcus, the dinosaur expert, had drawn her a picture of a triceratops wearing a crown. Emma had written her a note that said, "Thank you for being real with us," and David had given her a bookmark he had made with a quote written on it, Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. As Charlotte walked back through the hospital corridors toward the exit, she felt different than she had when she arrived. The doubt was still there. She suspected it might always be there to some degree. But it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a reminder to stay humble, to keep learning and to remember that everyone, even princesses, was just doing their best to figure out how to be brave in an uncertain world. The car ride back to Kensington Palace should have been a time for Charlotte to decompress and reflect on her visit to St. Paul's Mary's Hospital. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a light snack and had planned to brief Charlotte on her next week's schedule during the journey. But Charlotte found herself staring out the window, her mind spinning with everything she had experienced over the past few hours. The children's faces kept flashing through her memory. Marcus with his infectious grin and encyclopedia knowledge of dinosaurs. Emma with her wisdom that seemed far beyond her 10 years. David with his quiet determination to turn his pain into purpose. And little Lily whose simple question about fear had somehow unlocked something in Charlotte's heart. Each of these children had been fighting battles that most adults would find overwhelming. Yet they had faced Charlotte not with neediness or desperation, but with curiosity, humor, and a generosity of spirit that had completely changed her understanding of what strength looked like. As the royal car navigated through London's afternoon traffic, Charlotte's phone buzzed with a text message from her mother, Catherine. "How did the hospital visit go, sweetheart? Dad and I are proud of you for taking this on." Charlotte stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. "It was different than I expected. The children taught me more than I taught them." When they arrived back at Kensington Palace, Charlotte discovered that her schedule for the rest of the day had been cleared. Her parents had thought she might need some time to process her first major solo charitable engagement. But instead of feeling tired or drained, Charlotte felt energized in a way she had never experienced before. She had touched something real today, something that mattered beyond protocol and ceremony. Charlotte went to her room and sat at her small desk, pulling out a notebook her grandmother, Catherine, had given her for writing down her thoughts about her royal duties. Until now, the notebook had remained mostly empty, except for a few formal notes about proper curtsy techniques and the names of various dignitaries she might meet. But today, Charlotte found herself filling page after page with reflections on her hospital visit. She wrote about Marcus's joke that had made everyone laugh, about Emma's book project and her insight about kindness being the most important thing, about David's definition of courage, and about Lily's profound observation that being scared meant caring about what happened. As she wrote, Charlotte began to understand something that no royal protocol class had ever taught her. The power of authentic connection came not from having all the answers, but from being willing to be genuinely present with people in their moments of struggle and joy. That evening at dinner, Charlotte's parents asked her about the hospital visit. Usually, these debriefs focused on logistics. Had the timing worked well? Were there any protocol issues? Had the media coverage been appropriate? But tonight, Charlotte found herself telling a different kind of story. "The children weren't looking for me to be perfect," Charlotte explained to her parents as they sat around the family dining table. "They just wanted me to be real. When I admitted that I was scared sometimes, it didn't make them lose respect for me. It made them trust me more." Prince William, who had his own extensive experience with charitable work, nodded thoughtfully. "That's one of the most important lessons about public service," he told his daughter. "People don't need you to be superhuman. They need you to be genuinely human, but committed to using whatever influence you have to make things better." Princess Catherine smiled at her daughter with a mixture of pride and recognition. "You sound like your grandmother, Diana," she said softly. "She always said that the royal family's greatest power was not in their titles or wealth, but in their ability to connect with people and shine light on causes that needed attention." After dinner, Charlotte was supposed to spend an hour on her regular schoolwork before bedtime, but she found it difficult to concentrate on mathematics and French vocabulary when her mind kept returning to the conversations she'd had at the hospital. Finally, she closed her textbooks and returned to her notebook. writing down questions that had been forming in her mind throughout the evening. What if being young isn't a disadvantage in royal work, but actually an advantage? What if children like me can understand things about other children that adults might miss? What if the reason I felt so connected to the kids at the hospital wasn't despite my age, but because of it? These questions led Charlotte to a realization that would prove to be pivotal not just for this day, but for her entire understanding of her future role. She had spent so much energy worrying about whether she was ready for royal responsibilities that she had never considered whether her unique perspective as a young person might be exactly what some situations required. The next morning brought an unexpected challenge that would test Charlotte's newfound confidence in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Charlotte was scheduled to attend a formal royal function, a charity luncheon for an organization that supported educational programs for underprivileged children. It was meant to be a relatively simple appearance, where Charlotte would be introduced to the organization's leaders, observe the proceedings, and perhaps say a few brief prepared remarks. But when Charlotte arrived at the venue, she discovered that the event organizers had made a significant change to the program. Due to a last-minute cancellation, Charlotte was now expected to give a short speech to an audience of over 200 people, including major donors, government officials, and representatives from various children's charities. The prepared remarks that had been written for her were formal and generic, focusing on the importance of education and the royal family's commitment to supporting youth programs. Charlotte felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach as her private secretary explained the situation. This was exactly the kind of moment she had been dreading, a high-stakes public speaking situation, where she would be representing not just herself, but the entire royal institution. The audience would include people who had been working in children's advocacy for decades, people who might reasonably question what an 8-year-old princess could possibly contribute to their important work. As Charlotte sat in the holding room adjacent to the main ballroom, listening to the sounds of conversation and clinking glasses from the luncheon, she felt the old doubts creeping back in. The prepared speech in her hands felt stilted and empty, full of phrases that sounded important but said nothing that hadn't been said 1,000 times before. She thought about the reporter's question from the day before, about whether she was too young for these responsibilities, and wondered if this moment would prove those critics right. But then Charlotte thought about David's words from the hospital. Belonging isn't about being ready or being perfect. It's about showing up and being willing to learn, even when you're scared. She thought about Emma's insight that the most important thing was just being kind to people and trying to make them smile. She thought about Lily's observation that being scared was okay because it meant you cared about what happened. Charlotte looked down at the prepared speech in her hands, then folded it carefully and put it aside. If the children at St. Mary's Hospital had taught her anything, it was that authenticity was more powerful than perfection, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply tell the truth about your experience. When Charlotte was introduced to the audience, she walked to the podium with steady steps, her heart beating fast but her mind clear. She looked out at the sea of faces. Distinguished adults who had accomplished things she could barely imagine. People who had dedicated their careers to helping children in need. For just a moment, the old voice of doubt whispered that she didn't belong here, that she was just a child playing at being important. But then Charlotte took a deep breath and began to speak, not from the prepared text, but from her heart. Yesterday, I visited St. Mary's Children's Hospital, Charlotte began, her young voice carrying clearly through the room. I went there thinking that I was supposed to help those children, to inspire them somehow. But what actually happened was that they taught me something I had never understood before. The room grew quiet, and Charlotte could sense that she had the audience's attention in a way that surprised her. I learned that being brave doesn't mean you're never afraid. It means you show up anyway, even when you don't have all the answers. I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is admit that you're still figuring things out, because that's when real connections happen. Charlotte paused, thinking about Marcus and Emma and David and Lily, and felt a surge of confidence that seemed to come from outside herself. I know some people think I'm too young to be doing this kind of work, she continued, her voice growing stronger. And maybe they're right about some things. But I also think that being young gives me something important to offer. I can understand what it's like to feel uncertain, to worry about fitting in, to wonder if you're good enough. And I think there are a lot of children out there who need to see that someone who understands those feelings cares about what happens to them. The room was completely silent now, and Charlotte realized that every person in the audience was hanging on her words. But instead of feeling intimidated, she felt something she had never experienced before in a public speaking situation. She felt like she belonged exactly where she was. I may not have decades of experience in charity work, Charlotte said, looking directly at the audience with clear, confident eyes, but I have something else to offer. I have the perspective of someone who is still growing up, who remembers what it feels like to be small in a big world, who knows that sometimes what children need most is just to be seen and heard and valued for exactly who they are. Charlotte took another pause, and then spoke the words that would become legendary in royal family lore. Words that would be quoted in newspapers and biographies for years to come. I belong here not because I have all the answers, but because I'm willing to learn alongside the children we're trying to help. I belong here because I believe that caring about people matters more than being perfect, and because I think that sometimes the youngest voice in the room might have something important to say. The applause that followed was unlike anything Charlotte had ever heard. It wasn't the polite, ceremonial clapping that usually greeted royal appearances. It was genuine, enthusiastic appreciation from people who had been moved by the authenticity and wisdom of what they had just heard. As Charlotte left the podium and returned to her seat, she felt something settle into place inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to truly belong not just in a place but in a purpose. She had found her voice, and more importantly, she had found the confidence to use it. The weeks following Charlotte's speech at the charity luncheon brought changes that no one in the royal family had quite anticipated. Word of the 8-year-old princess's authentic, heartfelt remarks had spread far beyond the immediate audience of charity workers and donors. Video clips of her speech appeared on social media, news outlets around the world picked up the story, and most surprisingly, Charlotte began receiving letters from children across the globe who had heard about what she had said. These weren't the typical fan letters that royal family members usually received, filled with requests for autographs or photos. These were deeply personal letters from children who had connected with Charlotte's message about belonging, about being brave even when you're scared, and about the importance of showing up authentically in the world. A 10-year-old girl from Australia wrote about feeling different from her classmates because of a learning disability, but finding courage in Charlotte's words about not needing to be perfect. A 12-year-old boy from Canada who was being treated for cancer sent a drawing of himself and Charlotte standing together with the caption, "Brave kids helping other brave kids." Charlotte read every single letter that arrived, often spending her free time crafting personal responses. Her parents watched with a mixture of pride and amazement as their daughter seemed to effortlessly navigate conversations with children from vastly different backgrounds and circumstances. What struck them most was how Charlotte never talked down to these young correspondents or offered empty platitudes. Instead, she met them exactly where they were, acknowledging their struggles while celebrating their strength. Mrs. Henderson, Charlotte's private secretary, had to hire additional staff just to manage the volume of correspondence and the requests for Charlotte to visit other hospitals, schools, and charitable organizations. But what was even more remarkable than the quantity of these requests was their quality. Organizations weren't asking for Charlotte to simply show up and cut ribbons or pose for photos. They were specifically requesting her involvement in programs that dealt with helping children find their confidence, overcome challenges, and develop their own sense of belonging in the world. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from St. Mary's Hospital called the palace to share some unexpected news. In the weeks since Charlotte's visit, several of the children she had met had shown remarkable improvements not just in their spirits, but in their actual medical outcomes. Marcus, the dinosaur expert, had responded better to his treatment than doctors had dared hope. Emma had finished writing her book and was already working on a sequel. David had started a support group for other teenage patients, helping them find ways to channel their experiences into positive goals for their futures. "I've been working with sick children for over 20 years," Dr. Mitchell told Charlotte's mother during a phone call. "And I've never seen anything quite like the effect your daughter had on our patients." It wasn't magic or anything mystical. It was simply the power of one child showing other children that it's okay to be vulnerable, to be scared, and to still believe that you have something valuable to offer the world. Perhaps the most significant change, however, was in Charlotte herself. The uncertainty and self-doubt that had plagued her before her hospital visit hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had transformed into something different. Instead of paralyzing fears about whether she was good enough or ready enough, Charlotte had developed what her father called productive nervousness, a recognition that important work should feel a little scary, because it meant you were pushing yourself to grow and learn. Charlotte's approach to her royal duties began to evolve in ways that surprised even seasoned palace staff. When she was invited to visit a school for children with special needs, Charlotte didn't just tour the classrooms and meet with administrators. She spent time learning about each child's unique challenges and abilities, and then worked with teachers to develop activities where she could participate alongside the students, rather than simply observing them. When she attended a fundraising event for youth mental health programs, Charlotte didn't just give prepared remarks. She facilitated a discussion between adult donors and teenage representatives from various mental health organizations, helping to bridge the gap between the two groups in ways that adult moderators had struggled to achieve. The media began to take notice of Charlotte's unique approach to royal work. Rather than the typical coverage that focused on what she wore or how she compared to other young royals, journalists started writing about the substance of her contributions and the innovative ways she was connecting with the causes she supported. A prominent royal correspondent wrote an article titled, "The Princess Who Listens: How Charlotte is Redefining Royal Service for a New Generation." But perhaps the most important recognition came from an unexpected source. Queen Elizabeth II, Charlotte's great-grandmother, requested a private audience with Charlotte to discuss her recent charitable work. At 99 years old, the Queen had seen many members of the royal family struggle to find their unique voice and purpose within the constraints of royal tradition. She had watched some family members flourish in their roles while others seemed to wither under the pressure of constant public scrutiny and impossible expectations. The meeting took place on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the Queen's private sitting room at Windsor Castle. Charlotte had been nervous about the appointment, unsure whether her great-grandmother approved of her unconventional approach to royal duties or whether she was about to be counseled to return to more traditional methods. "Charlotte, my dear," the Queen began, gesturing for her great-granddaughter to sit beside her on the chintz sofa that had been her favorite spot for intimate family conversations for decades. "I've been hearing quite remarkable things about your recent charitable work." Charlotte waited quietly, unsure whether remarkable in this context was meant as praise or gentle criticism. "Your grandfather, Prince Philip, once told me that the secret to meaningful royal work was to find the intersection between the monarchy's traditional role of service and your own authentic passions and abilities," the Queen continued. "He said that when you find that intersection, magic happens, not just for the causes you support, but for the institution itself." The Queen reached over and took Charlotte's hand in her own, weathered but still strong hand. "I believe you have found that intersection, my dear. You have discovered that your youth, rather than being a limitation, is actually your greatest asset in connecting with young people who need to see that someone in a position of privilege and influence understands their struggles and believes in their potential." Charlotte felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fireplace crackling across the room. "But more than that," the Queen said, her voice growing softer but more intense. "You have done something that very few members of our family have achieved. You have found a way to be completely authentic, while still honoring the dignity and responsibility of your position. You have shown that being real and being royal are not contradictory qualities." As Charlotte left Windsor Castle that afternoon, she carried with her something more valuable than any formal endorsement or official recognition. She carried the knowledge that she had found her place not just within the royal family, but within her own sense of purpose and identity. The transformation in Charlotte's confidence became evident to everyone who worked with her. Palace staff, who had initially worried about putting such adult responsibilities on such young shoulders, now marveled at her ability to handle complex situations with wisdom that seemed to far exceed her years. But what impressed them most was that Charlotte had never lost her essential childlike qualities: her curiosity, her spontaneity, her ability to find joy in simple moments. Instead, she had learned to weave these qualities into her royal work in ways that made both more meaningful. 6 months after that first nervous visit to St. Mary's Hospital, Charlotte found herself back there for what had become a regular monthly visit. But this time, she wasn't there as a royal duty or a photo opportunity. She was there because the children had specifically requested her involvement in a new program they were developing, a peer support network where young patients could connect with other children facing similar challenges. As Charlotte walked through the familiar hospital corridors, she was greeted by children who now felt like old friends. Marcus, who had finished his treatment and was preparing to return to regular school, ran up to her with a new dinosaur book he wanted to share. Emma showed her the latest chapter of her ongoing book series about brave children helping other children. David, who was now serving as a junior volunteer at the hospital, introduced Charlotte to some of the newer patients who were just beginning their treatment journeys. But it was her conversation with Lily, now 6 years old and fully recovered from her surgery, that brought Charlotte's journey full circle. "Princess Charlotte," Lily said, tugging on Charlotte's sleeve to get her attention, "do you remember when you told me that you get scared sometimes?" "I do remember that," Charlotte said, kneeling down to be at eye level with the little girl. "Well, I wanted to tell you something," Lily continued with the serious expression that Charlotte remembered from their first meeting. "I'm not scared anymore, not like I used to be. But it's not because the scary things went away. It's because I learned something from you." "What did you learn?" Charlotte asked, genuinely curious. "I learned that being scared is okay, but not belonging somewhere is different from being scared to try belonging somewhere," Lily explained with the profound simplicity that only children seem to possess. "And you taught me that I always belong wherever I decide to be brave." As Charlotte hugged Lily goodbye that day, she realized that the little girl had just given her the perfect summary of everything she had learned over these transformative months. The feeling of not belonging that had once paralyzed her with doubt had been revealed as something entirely different. Not a truth about her inadequacy, but simply fear dressed up as fact. The real truth was simpler and more powerful. She belonged wherever she chose to show up with courage, authenticity, and care for others. Standing in that hospital playroom, surrounded by children who had taught her as much as she had hoped to teach them, Charlotte felt the deep, settled confidence of someone who had finally answered the most important question of her young life. She didn't belong here because she was perfect, or because she had all the answers, or because she was never afraid. She belonged here because she had decided to be brave enough to care, to learn, and to use whatever influence she had to make other people's lives a little brighter. That evening, as Charlotte sat in her room at Kensington Palace, writing in the notebook that had once been mostly empty, she penned the words that would become her personal motto, words that would guide her through all the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead in her royal journey. "I belong here, not because I am perfect, but because I am willing to be imperfect in service of something bigger than myself. I belong here not because I have all the answers, but because I'm brave enough to keep asking the right questions. I belong here not because I'm never afraid, but because I've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to let love and purpose be stronger than fear." Charlotte closed the notebook and smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow, and new chances to use her voice and her position to help other children find their own sense of belonging in the world. She was ready for all of it, not because she had become fearless, but because she had learned the most important lesson of all, that belonging isn't something you wait to feel, it's something you create by showing up authentically and courageously, exactly as you are.